In production, that's something that I really like to play with, is the phantom melodies that happen when the little aspects that you add to a sound interact with each other. They create melodies that you didn't write. And that is, for me, the most important part of a composition. I am Kaitlyn Aurelia Smith, and I'm a synthesist, producer, and composer. I use analog synths, modular synths, process my voice, software synths, and process orchestral instruments. I tend to use a lot of voice-like sounds in my production. I like them because they tend to bring out a sense of movement in a composition without needing to create harmonic movement. The first time that I heard Steve Reich's Music for 18 Musicians, it introduced me to a concept of minimalism and small movements over time. And I feel like voice-like sounds tend to give a similar psychosomatic feeling when listening to music, where you feel like the composition is changing because it gives it human-like quality and creates more aliveness in the song. Well, when I first started transitioning from classical music into electronic music, I started with a practice of just going out into the world and listening to what sounds are around me. And then I would pick one sound and I would pull it apart to be like, okay, how many sounds are actually making that sound? And when I was doing that practice, I realized how many sounds like that are actually existing in the world, where it's just these kind of funny, emotive, ambient sounds. Something that I really like to use Massive X for is I tend to use it the most when I'm making bass lines that are on an analog synth, and then I'll do an octave up in Massive X. I feel like the more complex waveforms that are collapsed in a digital way, because the harmonic series is different in a soft synth than in an analog synth, creates a bass line that is easier to hear on computer speakers and in headphones. So usually I would make a bass line in Massive, and then I would send this to an analog synth, pitch it down an octave on the analog synth. I'll do a micro shift on the offset so that it's creating a little bit of a chorus, because I really like to create effects in a more organic way than use effects. And then that way in Massive X, there's like a stable pitch. And so that's holding like what the ear will focus on. And then the analog synth can naturally be in its instability, because a lot of analog synths are. The soft synth, like Massive, will hold the tuning together so then the song doesn't feel like it's falling apart. There's a lot of features that I use in Massive X in complementary ways to the analog synths that I use, and in very different ways. It's almost like when someone goes from playing guitar to playing piano, it's like it uses a different part of your brain, just changing the orientation of the instrument that you're interacting with. And I think going from 2D to 3D, it changes how I would interact with it. Being able to animate all of these functions is very handy, because in a lot of analog synths, you don't have that option. The envelope is very exciting to me, the modulation envelope, but I really gravitate towards the animator, because I feel like when I'm creating so many different instances of a lot of different animation, then it's freeing up my focus, so then I can like go into performing melodies and performing harmonic structures, and there's an ecosystem that's just moving all around. Starting with noise when I'm making textures is like starting with the overtone series, which is a thing that I like to talk about a lot, because it's almost like starting at baseline, because you're starting from all frequencies. And depending on what like noise source you're using, if you're starting from all odd frequencies or all even, and then depending on what filter it's going through, it is creating different oscillations with what type of resonance that you're using. A lot of times, like if I were to use a sound like this, where it feels just like a more clean sound without the noise, then I would just add in some white and pink noise. I like to work a lot in the psychosomatic world, and so when you're just listening to it on its own, maybe just sounds like it has like a little bit of a shaker on it and isn't that much of like a character on the sound, but it's less for me about what it's doing on this sound and more about how it's interacting with the sympathetic frequencies on other sounds, because in production, that's something that I really like to play with is the phantom melodies that happen when the little aspects that you add to a sound interact with each other. They create melodies that you didn't write. And that is, for me, the most important part of a composition. I'm going to show you how I mix two wavetable oscillators together with a formant filter to create creature-like sounds and voice-like sounds. A formant filter, what it does to make it sound like a voice is it tends to cancel and accentuate certain frequencies so that it is changing the resonance. If you think about like old violins, like one of the fundamentals that instrument makers used to use was using the overtone series, and that everything is like fundamentally the overtone series, but depending on what resonating body it's in, changes what formants are on top of the fundamental. And so it's moving the overtone series and accentuating different aspects of it. When you change the fundamental of the different oscillators, it's changing the two frequencies that are interacting, and so it's changing the way that their overtone series are interacting. And then that mixed with a filter is changing what overtone series frequencies are creating the characteristic of the sound. A lot of times if I'm gonna make like a human voice with it, then I'll tend to mix my voice in it so that there's an element of breath. Or if I were gonna use this in my process to create more of a voice that doesn't just sound like creature, then I would mix it with analog gear and like use the MIDI and then mix my voice in it so that it gives it different layers of breath and different layers of frequencies. Because a lot of times when you listen to a human voice, there's a lot of layers. Like there's like a whole breath layer that's closing and opening at a different rhythm than the resonance. And then the sympathetic frequencies are also happening at a different time. So I like to create overlapping rhythms with the different wavetable oscillators and formants. Well, I love in Massive X, there's the animator. So in this, I would use one of the animators and just preset all the parameters so it was ready for the animation and design like how far I want them to go. And a lot of times I like to choose more subtle movement where, like, in addition to this, I like to add LFOs on like panning and just something where it feels like it's moving around you. So a lot of times I like to pick two different waveforms. And a lot of times when it's two different waveforms, they create moments where if they're animated, they'll have moments of cancellation and additive moments. So it will naturally feel like there's a lot of movement. And a lot of times when I make these sounds, they're in the background and they're more felt than heard. Like probably once you know they're there, then your ear will listen for them. But a lot of times I will pick a motion or set it up to an LFO and just let them naturally have a conversation. And then they'll be mixed in the sides, because it'll also create a sense of space where if there's a lot of different versions and instances of this, then the folding will create a feeling like you're moving through a 3D space. But again, it's more psychosomatic than heard, unless you know that it's there. So in my process, this would be maybe the second step, which is creating the MIDI information that I'm going to play with for analog synths, and creating more of like a mood palette that I'll build a song around. Here's one of the voice-like sounds. And I'll just solo through. And this is a bass line that I would send to a synth. And some of these, I'll record my voice also mimicking the sound. And a lot of them, when I'm soloing them, aren't necessarily choices where, as a soloed sound, it's like something I would represent as a song that I'm making, but it's them all together creating an environment. And then oftentimes I'll create a song structure on top of it, and then add the lyrics and the vocal part. And then all together, a lot of times, like if you were to deconstruct songs that I've released, it's like environment like this is in the song, and then there's a full production on top of this. So this is kind of like a baseline layer, and those are the parts that are in a baseline layer. And sometimes a song will have like 100 different instances of MIDI, and then I'll send them and blend new sounds, and then write the song structure.